countering disinformation, ensuring data protection, assessing the risks of Chinese investment in domestic technological infrastructure, and dealing with foreign influence operations. Alyssa Ayers, who I may also be on the dance, I believe is also, they'll have nothing left to say because I keep quoting people that are speaking otherwise here. But she's written recently that those kinds of issues, these democracy issues, could be taken up in a quadrilateral format together with Japan and Australia, which seems to me an excellent idea that could build on the comparative advantage offered by the 4 strong democracies in the region. It also requires something more fundamental and frankly much harder to pull off, which is to say that our political leaders need to provide less kindling for the autocrats who want to throw sparks on it. In a world where our competitors want to divide the democracies so that they are less able to solve national problems, generate national power, and in their minds pose a threat to them, we shouldn't be helping them do their job for them. And yet, if you look at both of our countries and read the newspapers in the last couple of days here and everywhere else, it's obvious how far we are from the ideal of more political unity and less political division. Too much political division is dangerous. It's not just unattractive, it's not just undesirable, but in a world where it will be used and sort of weaponized against us, it's dangerous. And both Americans and Indians have obvious challenges in this regard. Then there's what we might be able to do together on the external front. We've got a National Endowment for Democracy. Should India want to develop similar kinds of institutions over time, they could partner together in interesting ways, reinvigorate the community of democracies, coordinate efforts to link foreign aid to good governance, which we do through things like Millennium Challenge Corporation and other things, support the open flow of online information, resist state control of the internet, support the expansion of basic rights and freedoms in the Middle East, where millions of Indians reside, obviously, as expats and temporary workers and so forth. And there's a lot of items that one might want to add to that kind of very basic notional agenda, and happy to discuss it. But let me just close with a thought. As I was saying, the autocratic powers of the world today, the great powers, are endeavoring to ensure that the globe is going to be conducive to their style of governance. That style of governance lacks respect for the basic rights and liberties that we hold so dear and so core to our national identities in both the United States and in India. These are the values and liberties that Americans and Indians have advocated for, have over time thought are worth fighting for. When Indians go to the polls this year, it'll demonstrate once again, despite what you hear from our friends to the east of India, that a population of 1.3 billion people, give or take, is neither too large nor too fractious to actually choose its own leaders, and that the legitimacy of those leaders stems from the consent of those who are being governed by them. These are the kind of democratic rights, the liberal values that are vital, they're intrinsic to our national character, and both of our countries have demonstrated are worth fighting for. But they're coming under renewed pressure, and I would submit that we should work together in their support in the world today, which would be an endeavor fully worthy of the 2 great democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll now actually use my prerogative to ask a few questions on the panel before I open up. My first question is for Richard, but Dr. Paswan is also welcome to add his comments. Richard, you talked about the glue between India and the US. You mentioned the upcoming elections in India. Both are democracies, and yet both have there's a vast difference when it comes to participation in elections. In India, turnout in parliamentary elections normally averages around 60%, more than that. In the US, there have been elections, presidential, when you got 35-40%. In this context, how do you think Americans view the high participation in democracy, considering that US democracy does not attract that much of a voter enthusiasm or participation?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I have, as you watch Indian elections take place, they are breathtaking in their scope and scale. And I think that most American observers who I've talked to or have heard comment on this comment less on the participation rate. You know, people have been lamenting the low participation rate in the United States, and if they compare it to anybody, they say Australia's got compulsory voting. We should do the same thing. They're at 99%, except for those people who want to pay their $250 fine, or one of those stuff. So it's not that has not been the sort of animating feature. I think is the participation rate. It's been here's a country that, and sometimes we can forget this when policy types tend to go back and forth to New Delhi and not get out to rural areas or see still the challenges of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in India. Here's a large, heavily populated country with a large fraction of its people still trying to get out of poverty, and yet it organizes in truly breathtaking scope this visceral expression of democracy freely, on a regular basis. And I think most people find it inspiring.
Election Commission of India, really, they are doing the salutary job. In fact, 80 crores voters at their, and they are handling them, you can say, in that period of 45 days. And the most important things of Indian electorate is that the people on periphery, they have been exercising their franchise in much more numbers. And even the women and ladies, they are also. So this is the very important thing. These people who are, you can say, who have been economically, socially marginalized, they are taking these things as an opportunity to ventilate their own grievances. So they have been using all these things as the biggest tool. So that's why I can say that in India, this universal franchisee, of course, every Indian is relishing it, and they are trying to use it. And in time to come, we are sure in these elections, certainly our average vote percentage will be more than 75%. Because from the people's side, from the institution side, from the government sides, and from the also university side also, people are trying how these exercises can be made in abundance in the large numbers. So certainly we can say in that way, there are so many glues between India and USA, but in that way, USA will have to follow the India.
My second question has to do a bit with what Professor Paswan said. You talked about diversity. You explained what DEMO, the entire sort of what democracy stands for in India. But if we look around the world, we look in India, we look in United States, we look at many other democracies, there's been a growth, there's been a certain common phenomenon, which is that elites around the world have tended to look down upon people's choices. The underlying principle of democracy is the collective wisdom of the people is best. And yet, there are people's decisions which elites don't respect, and elites believe that there are certain things that the people are not doing. How does one reconcile this fact that people know best with the rise of what people fear, which is whether it's chauvinistic nationalism, populism, and do either of you see India as being able to handle this rise of populism, which is growing around the world and will sooner or later hit every country?
See, in the world, can say, it's a democracy, mobocracy, kleptocracy. So democracy is being also, you can say, getting defamed on that line. Some kleptomanic people are running the country in the name of democracy. So, but I can say that in the world today, this is the best available instrument, this is the best available tool to govern the people. And yet the best is yet to come. So the entire globe is is trying to have the quest of the best and finest form of democracy also. And of course, the people who are getting hurt of it, and you can say the prerogatives which are being snatched, being taken away by the democratic means, by the populace, by the masses. Some people, some class people are also opposing it, no doubt. So you can say this, if I say that elite concept and the Dalit concept of India, you can show if Dalit are the toiling masses of the world, and elite are the, you can say they are the manipulators, you can say. So they are trying to, you can say, disfigure this process. So that's why we will have to fight all such type of vicious forces who are trying to denigrate it and trying to, you can say, delimit the expansion of democracy. So that fight almost every country is having, and that sort of you can say tension are there. In the same way, you can say you see the way we India, we have been the Gandhi, we have been the thinkers like the Lohia, we have been thinkers like the Ambedkars, now the Deen Dayal Upadhyay. So this about our own indigenous thinkers, indigenous people who have contributed in the definition, the concept of a democracy. We are working on that. Yet the best of these people, you can say, rather we have started saying that we need the GLAD theories: Gandhi, Lohia, Ambedkar, Deen Dayal. So this is the GLAD theory. So I am sure that under this present dispensation of Modi ji, certainly India will be glad and the world also be glad in tune with the India. So we are trying to imbibe the values of Gandhi, Lohia, Ambedkar, and Deen Dayal. And if that will happen, certainly those type of, you can say that vicious forces and the people with the nefarious design, certainly their design will be smashed.
Richard.
Well, there's a couple of things in your question together. And, in India, I mean, it is remarkable, as people used to often point out, that in the previous government, in a Hindu-majority country, you had where communal tensions have a long history. You had a Christian head of the party, you had a Sikh prime minister, and a Muslim president all at the same time, and it seemed fine to everybody. Not sure we could pull that off in the United States right now. And in that sense, there's kind of a test, I think, of Indian democracy. In the United States, we always talk about America as the shining city on a hill, and then the debate gets into how much you want to promote that light externally. And I think particularly in Asia, but not just in Asia, Indian democracy is a test of how large and diverse a country can be while still accomplishing things and protecting the rights of its minorities all at the same time. And I kind of alluded to this in my opening remarks, but our Chinese friends love to say, they like to call it Western-style democracy. Western-style democracy, where everybody kind of goes to the polls and chooses. Are you crazy? I mean, look at the people we're still trying to pull out of poverty. We have. They're not sort of educated enough to make an informed decision, and we have such a diverse population. We have Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and we have Tibetan Buddhists in Tibet. All these other kinds of things. I mean, the country would fly apart. It's too diverse to even hold together if you were to. And so you need somebody to kind of an iron fist. A Y is preferably iron fist at the top. India is the counter argument, and to all of those things, it shows it's not pretty all the time. Let's concede that it can be messy as hell, but it's certainly better than a couple people who sort of they and their friends appoint themselves as qualified to run the country, and no one else gets to choose who their leaders or have any say in what the policies are that they will execute. That then gets back to, well, okay, who are these guys you elect? And then, the representative democracy aspect of this, as opposed to, you don't want to just have direct democracy where the wisdom of the people sort of frictionlessly transitions into policy. You want to elect people like a new generation of Ambedkars and Gandhis and things like that say, hey, we got to act out of enlightened political self-interest. Sure, you can win votes and be elected by appealing to a particular constituency, but there's something more at stake here. And by the way, we're not always going to be in power, and so we'll be, if nothing else, a political minority at some point. And so let's make sure that we, ensure that it's not a winner take all or majority population or majority in the Lok Sabha or anything else take all kind of thing. Again, easier said than done.
Thank you. A final question for both of you, and this has to do a bit with what I gleaned from both your talking points, which is that let's look at how the India-US relationship and democracy plays in. During the Cold War, the threat was from communism primarily. So from the US point of view, economic freedom was considered more important than political freedom. And most American alliances were with countries which were free markets, even if they were not democracies, and very often ended up being dictatorships. This next round of global competition between US and China, which is centered on the Indo-Pacific, is the shared value of democracy going to be the foundation of future alliances and not economics? Because if you look at Japan, you look at South Korea, Australia, India, all of them are democracies, but their path to economic freedom and the extent to which they open the economy is very different from the United States. So can democracy, or let's say the idea of political freedom, diversity, dignity, equity, mobility, and sort of, can that be what sustains the alliance system in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and can that be the basis which can sustain the India-US relationship going ahead?
Yeah, I'll take a first shot, and not on its own. I mean, the United States and India were democratic during the Cold War, and we weren't particularly friendly. So I think that's evidence that no, however construed the value side of things, whether those are economic values or political values, is not on its own enough to sustain, I wouldn't use the term alliance, but a strategic partnership or whatever you want to call it. You need shared interests. You got to start from shared interests. In the absence of shared interests, you're not going to get very far. But if you have shared interests and you put into that shared values as well, you're going to get much farther than if you just have an alliance of interest because you have a common potential enemy, threat, competitor, whatever you want to call it in China. You have that, and that will push India and the United States together to some degree. But there's much more potential, I believe, beyond that, and much more potential for sort of cooperative activity because it's not just an interest-based affinity. It's not just saying we'd be better doing things together than separately because we have this threat, and so, well, begrudgingly, we might as well do it. It's because we have a greater deal of affinity between the political systems of our two countries and the values that we espouse.
See, democracy is creating a vote bank, no doubt. But how that vote bank can be transferred into the thought banks? The world today needs certainly standing at this juncture. That is, it is searching a new sort of some leading guiding principles also. So of course, democracy is creating some thought banks, vote banks. How this vote can be converted to thought? That's a call of the time. See, in India, Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai. Here, Bahujan, majority, not Sarvajan, not all people. So this journey is going, from Bahujan to Sarvajan, from majority to all. So here I referred one name by Dindal Upadhyay. He is the man who is talking of integral humanism. Integral humanism. Now, this sort of philosophy is being propounded in different parts of the world in different names. But certainly, entire world is in search of such a toll mechanism, you can say, whether the maximum benefits to maximum people can be delivered. So, of course, in any name, what name you can say, but in this part that democracy, how democracy, you can say participatory democracy is different, delivering democracy is different, consultative democracy is different. So only not direct indirect democracy, but all sort of experimentation are going on. In Hindi, Sanskrit, there are there are 4 words we would like to share with you. And one word is Sarvodaya. Whenever Gandhi was there, Sarvodaya, all people should prosper. But it is, you can say, it is a hypothetical statement. Sarvodaya, it's a huge, you can say, exercise yet to be done by the world. Now, word is Antyodaya. That was given by Ambedkar. First, you start the helping people from the last people. Last people must get the facility first. So this Sarvodaya, Antyodaya. And then Lohia was given the Abhyudaya, growth of everyone. But now, can say, every country with their own past, with their own glorified past, they must try to seek how their people can be given growth in their own way. That's why I can say also India, we're trying that this resurgent India, resurging India, how it can start with the help of the, you can say, past also, and with the help of the modern technology and the modern outlook also. So this resurgent India is this is the present buzzword for we people, and how India can resurge in the globe and can come to the global, come to the rescue of the global, can say, agonies. So certainly, every country should try to search out such things, and that searching. That's why I told in the very earlier that we are a country of seekers. We are not country of believers. That's why our things are evolving gradually, evolving slowly. But we don't say that our thought and our philosophy and our things are the ultimate in itself. We don't say like that. We don't boast of that. So we are a continuous process of seeking the things. That things maybe of the governance also, maybe of the economy also, maybe of the ethics also, maybe of the society also. That's why we try to seek the things. That's why we don't try to impose upon the things. We are seeking regularly, and I'm sure that in time to come, India will be in a position to seek some good modalities for the global citizens.
I'll open it up for Q&A. Kindly wait for the mic to reach you, and then please say your name and affiliation. Jay.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Pandey and the panelists. My question is actually in regards to something that you've left off on in your previous question, and that is, here in this country, we're having a debate right now as to interventionism and America's role in trying to quote unquote spread democracy, but we often find that that comes part and parcel with, military intervention. And right now we should look at the example of Venezuela. America has, made its stake in the issue very clear, and India has also made its stake in the issue very clear, and they are diverging points of view. How do you, both panelists, reconcile that? And something that also just dawned on me, that 2 of the leading proponents of non-interventionism in the US are actually Hindus in Congress, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and Congressman Ro Khanna. And I don't know if there's anything to be extrapolated from that, but that literally just dawned on me as I was thinking of this. So perhaps we can discuss that. Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything to that, but I'll leave that to others to determine when you're talking about the members of Congress. The debate over, the really searching debate over whether and how to promote democracy abroad has been a pretty painful one in, as everybody probably knows, in U.S. foreign policy circles since the Iraq War, for a couple of reasons. 1, because Iraq went so badly and was so costly. 2, because the notion of democracy promotion became conflated with regime change and the United States going in and toppling governments that it doesn't like under the guise of democracy promotion, and then, sometimes leaving things looking worse than when we started. But that leaves aside, that kind of thing is not what I'm describing, and I don't think that's really what's on offer here. You know, we each time we sort of do one of these things, you know, in Iraq, we said, okay, well, we invaded the country and toppled the government and occupied it and, you know, tried to turn it into a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. All right, that didn't work well, so we're not going to do that again. In Libya, we helped NATO and the Libyans topple the government, but we didn't go in and we didn't occupy the government. We would like it to be democratic. Well, that didn't work. You know, that is a very important debate about military intervention. But I think it's too easy to conflate it with military intervention and to say, well, see, that's why we shouldn't be in this line of work. Because wholly apart from military intervention, there's many different instruments available, ranging from diplomacy to foreign aid to all kinds of other technical assistance, all kinds of other things that countries can and do to support democracy and democratic practice abroad. There's going to be foreign policy differences. You know, the United States and India have one currently on Venezuela, but also on Iran and the Iran deal, and also on Russia, and also on, you know, you could probably count 5 more off the top of your head. And so I don't think we should expect that we're going to converge on what to do in any of these instances. The thing is to, where we do converge, do something together.
See, we'll have to see how we are dealing with the infiltrators. You know, infiltrators and the refugees are not to be reckoned at the same scale. If any country is facing such type of, you can say, trespassing or the infiltration, then for their own citizen safety and security, one should take such strict measures, no doubt. I don't know what is the position on the Venezuela borders, I don't know, but if it's a case of infiltration, then the country head must try to protect their own citizen first, then the neighbors.
Right up front.
Thank you. I'm Alan Kronstadt, Congressional Research Service. Well, I think there's widespread agreement that the quality of democracy is critically dependent on quality of the voter, maybe specifically access to relatively objective information, critical thinking skills, education, etc. So there's been some signs in India that, you know, there's problems in this area. There's been some constriction, some embattlement of press freedoms. There's, you know, widespread problems identified with the education system. And also, more recently, I guess the rapid spread on social media of information that can be false, inaccurate, often emotive, and potentially dangerous. So obviously, we've solved all these problems in the United States. But I'm just wondering if the panel has comments on the relationship between, you know, the quality of voter knowledge, education, critical thinking skills, access to objective information, and the future of democracy. Thanks.
Maybe I can comment on one aspect of this, which is, you know, all of the factors that you mentioned obviously play into, you know, elections and the quality of how well-informed and objective voters are and so forth. But the technology aspect, and particularly social media, is still a pretty new piece. And in an open society like the United States or like in India, it's actually pretty hard to deal with, especially when you have some very strong incentives for people, both domestically and foreign, to spread disinformation or get on top of rumors of false information and so forth. The whole sort of crux of the matter was struck home to me a few years ago. If any of you have kids that live in the area, there was this killer clown rumor that was going around town, and you know, my young kids were actually scared that there were these killer clowns that were hiding out in the woods outside their schools and were, you know, waiting to just nab people. I don't know what they thought the killer would juggle for them or something, but you know, they were scared of these killer clowns, and so the Washington Post did a long article, not hard to do, debunking this, but also saying, here's where the rumor started, here's how it was spread, the whole thing, it's false, it's false, it's false. So I showed it to my then, I don't know, 10-year-old daughter, and she said, well, that's one website that says it's not true, but I've got like 2 or 3 that says it is true. And so, you know, part of this is not education is classically defined. It's education about how you distinguish sources of authoritative information from sources of non-authoritative information, false information from real information, information that is, designed specifically to elicit an emotional a response in the politically affected voter versus other things. And again, if what I see in sort of our education system is par for the course, we don't even touch that right now. And I think that's going to be part of the conversation.
Yes, that the entire world is facing such type of problems. This Facebook has taken away the face-to-face, and face-to-face things have to be really. We need today to discuss something face-to-face, and then only their solutions can be sorted out. But after all, cyber securities are there, and cyber surveillance should be there. And still, the entire world is in position how the uniform cyber security and uniform cyber mechanism can be set up. That is the call of the time now. And of course, in that stage, the time will come then the people who are doing offenses on the cyber world, they will be punished. But we should be, we should stay alert on such issues, because it has already taken, so many things and try to tarnish the image of the country, some religion, some you can say some communal groups also. So we should be alert enough to get not to be swayed by such rumors and canards.
Raju Kutsregar. Both countries have had some experience about underprivileged classes in various forms, and there is sort of a, I would say, perhaps a mixed experience results. So I wanted to hear from both speakers here what their personal opinion is about what the experience has been, and compare it with the other countries' experience, and comment on where it should go.
Well, that's a really easy one. I grew up in Louisiana, so I saw some of these things firsthand. I mean, the first, and in some ways easier, is to remove the structural discrimination that is in place, which was certainly true, obviously, in the American South, and all the way through the 1960s and beyond, and which India removed formally in its constitution by saying, we're sort of getting rid of caste-based distinctions and all sorts of things. The harder thing is how you balance affirmative action and the sort of positive inducements so that where there are non-formal barriers to economic movement or kind of growth as an individual in a society, those are not formal, so the government wants to do something about it. Well, how does it do something for sort of one group or one set of individuals and not do it without harming another? And and it gets obviously very, very complicated, as we're seeing even in the run-up to this election in India, and then it also creates a set of political incentives depending on how big the voting bloc is you're talking about, and who, if you think they might swing your way, if they're sort of seen as getting some sort of benefit. I don't think there's an answer in the abstract to any of that, or if there is, maybe someone can offer it. I don't see one. I think it really comes down to the very specific circumstances. Both the United States and India, I think, have made really remarkable progress, but it's variable. There's obviously still discrimination and barriers in the United States. In India, the urban areas are very different than the rural areas. Every time, just having worked on India for years, the concern seems to be flipping from, how do we help the lower castes and the backward classes to, is the government sort of setting aside so much that the, upper castes don't have access to the same education and job set-asides that they would, and now are upper castes sort of eligible for essentially affirmative action that they would not be accorded given their sort of status in society. All very complicated stuff, but still a long way to go on the informal and the the sort of positive side of what you do. But, task one is get rid of the barriers.
See, poverty in any part of the world is threat to the prosperity of all other part of the world. So nobody can stand now poverty and the destitutions. So everybody has to devise some ways how it can be contained, how it can be mitigated. So far as India is concerned, you must be aware, you look like Indian. That's why you are must knowing now this reverse social engineering is going on now. The reverse social engineering. Now in the last month you must have heard that the reservation has been given to the upper caste poor people. They have been given the reservation now. So this is considered reverse social engineering. So that cycle is now, of course, is getting repeated. And you can say world is really cyclical, not linear. That's why reverse social engineering is going on. And I'm sure that it is going to pay dividend to the country. And dividend to the party also, which party has utilized and is applied in that era. So that's why you can say that nobody can now ignore the poverty. So that's an established fact. And of course, in the world today, if we convert those things, those quality into quantity, those people in the voting strength, certainly that is also going to pay. So now, world now can't afford to defer the priority of poverties. You said that's why now we'll have to share. The rich people will have to share their own booties with the poor people. Certainly, otherwise, now communists are not coming again in the on this globe. Some countries are having, of course, that sort of snatch away, take away politics are not going to incur in again in India, again in the world. But certainly, we'll have to mind those people, and we'll have to design some proper programming, the proper schemes for them. Then we can't ignore them. So I'm sure that, and of course, entire world is looking after the poor people, and even UN also paying attention to the poor people, and every country will have to pay attention to them.
Stanley Kober, on this issue of democracy in India, I brought up an article from The Hindu from 2014. The world's largest democracy is faced with a crisis of faith. It is no longer possible to put off the question, are we a democracy only in name? The question here is the growth of Hindutva in India. If that gets too strong and dominates, democracy is majority rule, but minority rights. What would protect the minority rights?
See, first thing, this Hindutva, in fact, this is not Hinduism, this is Hinduness. And of course, each and every global land is being predominated by some sort of people, whether some racial people, some caste people, some colored people are there. And their impact, or you can say their culture, is so pervasive. It is not aggressive, but it's so pervasive. Then everybody, wants to get attached to that. So this, you can't say, if the problem is there for the unemployment, for the jobs, if poverty people are raising some issues, you can't, we just can't simplify the things. This is the Hindu and non-Hindu issues. There's some other issue also. Some law and order problems are there. Some problems for the, you can say, the job clinchings are also there. Some people are trying more and more share for them. So that's why the world must be, take note of this. Merely some things should not be simplified like this. It is a Hindu and non-Hindu issue. And that is the bogey of, you can say, bogus news is being spread over. And that's why we Indians are very much, and I request you all people also, to be scared of it. so that the people may not get some, take disadvantage of these situations. So things are something different, and it is being narrated in some different way. So I am sure that this is the duty of the embassy and mission also, how that sort of things can be, can say it can be stopped and nipped in the bud. So nothing like that. Some, stray issues of may take place, but it's not a general issue. It's rarely one or two issues in a couple of years. So really, there are so many other issues also that can be referred, that can be publicized in the world. But some good things are not to be publicized. People are taking more interest in some bad things, some good nasty things. So I don't think that this is the situation, Hindu, non-Hindu. It's different issues. Different issues on some different notes. People are fighting on different things. That's why nothing sort of that like that Hindu, non-Hindu issues are there.
I'll take, the last two questions. Mona and the lady. It up here, and then the lady, these two, the two, yeah.
Thank you. Mona Dave with the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you for the plug earlier. I had a question about the, elections are just one element of people's participation in their democracy, right? I wanted to get a sense of the space available for civil society, journalists, and others in forming and helping to frame the discourse that, and the debate that gets into these questions of government service delivery. So actually the thought process that goes into policy making. What is the space available for civil society and media in doing that in India?
And I'll take the last one, the lady red. Yeah, right here.
Sorry. Mariam Simantwala, I'm with the U.S. State Department, and I served in New Delhi. So a question on military, or rather non-military interventionism. You talked a little bit about promoting basic rights in the Middle East. One of the challenges that I saw firsthand is with, for instance, 3 million plus Indians in Saudi Arabia. The Indians found it difficult, the Indian embassy in particular, to have some of those difficult discussions because there were so many economic and other interests. What would it take in India or for India to flex its muscles with respect to rights promotion so that they feel like they have more leverage in the Middle East, given the number of people residing there, the remittances coming home? And wouldn't a better, perhaps a better area of shared values and cooperation be perhaps work on countering violent extremism and reducing foreign influence in the form of proselytization towards radicalism stemming from the Middle East?
Sure. I'll take this last one. Part of this gets back to, I guess, what we're talking about when we talk about promoting democracy. And usually what we mean is promoting liberal democracy, which is to say the liberal part of that meaning basic rights and liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom not to be beaten for what you think, things like that. And democracy, the freedom to choose, the ability to choose your leaders. In places like the Middle East, I think that the most effective area to push is on the liberal side rather than the democracy side, not because of the off-sided fear that suddenly we'll get elected, Hamas 3.0 or whatever, which people often talk about, but simply because, having worked on some of these things in the U.S. government many moons ago, it's pretty hard to sit across the table from an autocratic leader and suggest that he hold an election he thinks he'll lose. It is easier and much more incremental and also meaningful to people's lives to be able to coax them toward better respect for basic human rights and liberties. So that's kind of an abstract, I guess, prelude to the question of what would it take for India to flex its muscles on behalf of the often quite ill-treated workers who go to the Gulf in particular. there's multiple answers to that question, right? On the one hand, it would take a leadership in India that decided that that was worth whatever it thought it would lose in the bargain from doing that. Politically, the way these things seem to go, with a grossly inappropriate example would be the Khashoggi thing, but but crises like that have a way of focusing minds. I mean, had you asked the question, what would it take for the United States to stand up to Saudi Arabia and say, end the war in Yemen and these other things? Well, it took a very dramatic incident. And so politically, that's sometimes what these things take. We should go after them because of that, but that's just a political reality. On the CVE stuff, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I mean, we can certainly work with India, particularly given the relative dearth of violent extremism in India compared to its neighbor of smaller size, for example. There's certainly lessons to be learned there. But I see the countering violent extremism thing as a separate endeavor from the basic promotion of human rights and democratic liberties. And I worry that by conflating them and trying to instrumentalize, well, the real reason why we want people to live in democracies is so they won't become extremists and come kill us. Then we fall back into the, well, this is really all a cover for this kind of regime change, kill terrorists kind of plan that the United States has cooked up somewhere. We should not want extremists, right? And we should counter violent extremists, but we should also want, I believe, more democracy in the world. And in that endeavor, I think the United States and India have enough views that are similar enough to form the basis of, an ever more ambitious bilateral agenda.
Especially your reply, in India, our media houses are also, they are mobilizing you can say, people's support for voting more and more. And the civil society also. Along with Election Commission of India and our political parties, these media houses and the civil society are really, they have done the excessive jobs for this heavy turnout in our polling. And some more turnouts are yet to come. And our target is that in the coming elections, how 90% people, and how voting rate also can be made mandatory. Everybody should have vote. That's why democracy is repeatedly, it's getting corrected and totally, how more enlightened can democracy can be given to the people of the world. So that's why we're also trying to think how all elections happens, every year we face the elections in India. So we're trying how simultaneous elections can be taken place at one point of time, and how the more and more voting turnouts can be advanced, that we're trying. So certainly you can say, all stakeholders are giving its fullness to this issue. That's why this is much more, apparent in India.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists and thank everybody. We will now take a 10-15 minute break, and then the final panel on democracy and governance will start. Thank you. the third, but I believe it's going to be a wonderful panel on stage. Todd Lindbergh, Dan Twining, and Dr. Balasubramaniam, please.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, well, welcome back to this wonderful discussion on delivering democracy in India. I'm Todd Lindbergh. I'm a senior fellow here. I work on national security matters, and I've had some involvement in human rights and democracy over the years. There are two distinct skill sets represented on the panel. One is detailed knowledge of India. That would be Dr. Balu and President Twining of the International Republican Institute, and then there would be the moderating skill set, which I represent here, and so that will be my task. I think one of the, if you had sort of 7 wonders of the political world, though, I think India would be one of them, and it's because so much works in so many interesting ways that that frankly are not necessarily obvious upon a distant examination. And so we're going to have 2 experts speak directly to why this works. And I don't want to take up too much time with the introduction here so that we have plenty of time for some short presentations and then a little interaction on the panel. And of course, we'll invite everybody in the room into the discussion as well. So I think with that in mind, I turn to you, Dr. Bala. Can you illuminate why India works?
Well, I would get a Nobel Prize then. Thanks. Speaking in the last panel is always a challenge for the speaker as well as for the audience. And I've been watching from the morning, from the keynote address, the population has been steadily dwindling. Wondering if there's a 4th panel, whom would the speaker speak to? And so thankfully we've been spared that embarrassment. Democracy and governance has been such buzzwords from this morning. We've been talking about it so much. I'm not even sure what it means anymore, because it seems to mean so many things to so many people and so many different ways of looking at it. A little bit about me. I'm actually a physician. So the farthest you can get from being democratic in India, because you tell your patients what to do. And my life started off as a doctor, then as a public health person, then management, then to policy and all sorts of stuff. So most of my life, I lived for at least 30 years of my life in the forest of India, with what we consider now to be most marginalized indigenous tribal communities. And so I think being an activist sort of gives me the liberty and the freedom to really talk about democracy, because I have seen it work and not work at the grassroots. So everything I'm going to speak here is from what happens or does not happen at the real levels where it matters. So it's nice to talk about it in conferences and have debates about it, write books. I've written a book called I, the Citizen, a lot about citizen engagement and stuff like that. But how does it really play out? And so before coming here, I was just talking to a few people on the ground, people who I believe are people. And that's what democracy is all about. It's all about people. And I was talking to a homemaker and wanted to know from her, what would governance mean to her? Because so much of energy and excitement now, everything's happening in India and so much of change. And she was very clear in what it meant to her. Governance just meant that evening 1 hour of electricity supply doesn't get cut. So in India, what we typically call power cut, it's not the political power that gets cut, but the electrical power that gets cut. And so there's such a scramble for power and such a big deficit it was at least a deficit in India, that for her, governance simply meant not just having 24/7 power, because which meant a refrigerator would run, the food wouldn't get spoiled, and she would get to see her evening soap opera without missing it out every day. And so I was wondering, and that's all it meant to her, and that's okay. Then I was talking to a street vendor, and what would governance mean to him? He was very clear. Governance just meant that beat policeman or the civic agency inspector who comes doesn't take more than the 50 rupee bribe that he would normally take. So that's all that governance meant to him. He just meant that's it. And so we can talk any amount on governance, how democracy is playing out, but for that little fellow selling vegetables on the street corner, saving the 50 rupees meant governance in action or something working. So for him, whether this big level corruption means anything or not, for him, every day saving 50 rupees meant a big deal. And so I can go on and on about the stories, but about just the tribals I lived with. And I asked a very elderly tribal who was a victim of, in my opinion, misgovernance 40, 45 years ago when the forests were nationalized and they were so brutally thrown out of the forest with no rehabilitation. And we had to actually sue the state for rehabilitation. And so what would governance mean to her? And to her, it simply meant, leave me alone. I just don't want the government to come in my life. I just don't want you to come and tell me the forests don't belong to me. I just lived in the forest for centuries. Now just leave me alone. But I said, you can't be left alone. The state does just, democracy doesn't leave people alone, right? We have to meddle, and then we have to, in the name of making their lives better. And so this, I told it, but the state has to do something for you. You're after all a tribal, and we have to take care of you. Now, it's funny how poverty is created in the first place, and then we want to alleviate poverty in the second place. And so I always felt government has to justify governance all the time. And so I asked, what would it mean to you now? You have to have something from it. And her answer was so simplistic, so profound, and so impossible to deliver. All that governance meant to her was the state could provide her dry firewood every week. And so fast forwarding 40 years of her getting out of the forest, now the state actually providing cooking gas and what I spoken about in the morning. So governance actually happens in such extraordinary complexities. In India, we have all spoken about the diversity of India, the number of states, the number of languages. Just to give an example, I come from the small little second-tier city called Mysore, which is close to Bangalore, and it gets submerged in Bangalore. Nobody knows anything beyond Bangalore. Especially in the US, if I say the outsourcing capital of US, it's Bangalore. And so everybody knows Bangalore, but nobody knows Mysore. And I come from the small little city. And you know, the funny part is the whole country is so diverse. Just 100 kilometers every side I drive from Mysore, I can show you a different culture, different kind of food style, a different kind of dress sense, everything different. How would even governance and democracy be the same? You can't really homogenize this package and say whole of India is like this. So I think the fundamental mistake most of us do when describing India is something like a very concrete, homogenized, feel and touch entity. And I think that's a mistake. It doesn't work that way. It's very different. And in this fundamentally vibrant country, throw in ideas like democracy, which we don't understand how it evolved in India. Let's look at, I just want to get back into stuff which was not spoken from this morning. 1947, we get a political freedom. And look at the way we endowed ourselves with freedom. Nowhere in the world you had an opportunity where freedom was secured the way India secured it, from through non-violent means. And then maybe that's a problem, that's a blessing. It's written about a lot, but I think it's a problem too, because we undervalue democracy itself after that. And then the transition that happened, we had absolutely no, we took a long time to develop socio-economic freedom. We got political freedom, all right. But what I really shudder and what I really worry about, or earlier worried about, was the way in which we got ourselves freedom. You know, we were seen as subjects of a benign crown. Somebody would come and take care of us. And so citizens never really were citizens, they were subjects. And it took us 60, 65 years to get out of the subject mentality, you know, always waiting for the state to provide. And the state enjoyed it. The state, for 60, 65 years, enjoyed being a provider. So all goods and services, constitutionally guaranteed, make more and more acts which are rights-based, which will just give you everything. You have to do nothing. In fact, I had written a piece many years ago, how in one of the states in India, if you're privileged to be born, you have to be born, that's all. If you're born, you're given an incentive. If your parents were from two different castes, you're given an incentive. To grow up, you're given an incentive. You're given free education, you're given a bicycle, you're given slippers, you're given everything. You get into high school, you get a laptop. And you get married, you get an allowance for that. And then if your husband dies, you get an allowance for that too. So all you got to do is be born. So if you're living in a country where citizenship is seen as recipientship, and then you want democracy to work. So I think governance and democracy are words which we simply can't throw around this way. And from that to what India is today, I think the last 4 or 5 years, as somebody who's been researching and writing about a lot about citizen engagement, I think the real change is not what is visible, the 8% growth, the 7% growth, these narratives that we all sing. But the real invisible change is what I wanted to speak to all of you about. And that is so powerful, and I can really, I really, it's sort of, I'm understruck to even imagine what kind of consequences it will leave this country with. So I believe any democratic engagement, beyond the political engagement of voting and elections and all that we hear about, is actually a dynamic equilibrium of four strong forces that happens in any country, the way it's getting played out in the United States today to any other country anywhere in the world. The first, I think, is the way the country frames its rules. That sort of gives us a lot of indication of how the country has matured or has evolved, and how does it really deliver on those rules, the institutions it creates to deliver on those rules. We can frame the rules. In India, it's very nice. We frame a lot of rules. I keep joking with my friends, and I was an anti-corruption commissioner in India for 5 years, and I know how it plays out. My conviction rate was 0%, because we had an institution to deliver on fighting corruption, but the rules framed were designed in such a way that you could never really convict anybody. So that's the way institutions are created. So that's one kind of a situation. You frame rules, but you have institutions to deliver on them. More importantly, you would have political leadership that's mature enough, that understands how these rules are framed, and more importantly, either destroys institutions which are barriers to delivering on these rules, or actually builds institutions to deliver on these rules. And I think that is a powerful message I see from India the last 4 or 5 years. We have a leadership today which understands political stability and the value of political stability. It understands the rules that need to be framed or the rules that need to be repealed. For the first time in independent India, we have had close to 1,300 old rules, or 1,700 rules that were useless 100 years old, a product of a colonial system, actually repealed. Many people didn't even realize that the rules were still there and they were not even removed. And so we needed a government to actually repeal those rules. And that happened the last 3 or 4 years. And simple things like that to something much more important to me is the fourth quadrant, which I really think is where democracy is alive and well. Now, India is a very noisy democracy, and we can see that every day is a new thing to write about. It's a cartoonist delight. It's a columnist delight. I write a lot of columns on this, and it's fun for me. Every day I can write a column. There's something energizing happening. There's something demoralizing happening. Depending on what side of the coin you want to be in, you can write an article. And that's a fun part of being in India. But that is just the superficial part. Just go deeper. What is happening and what is so powerful today is the fourth quadrant of how do we shape, how does the authorizing environment get created? The authorizing environment, which actually can put pressure on the political leadership to frame the right kind of rules and to create the institutions to deliver on these rules. Now, without this authorizing environment, any country can never really be a democracy. And in a democracy, the authorizing environment is framed by enlightened citizens. So my life's work is with citizens and engaging with citizens, and how do you really enlighten citizens to do it? And I think in India, the biggest challenge we had was 60, 65 years of being an entitled citizen. Suddenly being called down to be an empowered citizen, the transition is not easy. But that's exactly what the Prime Minister has done. And that's the beauty of it. The political leadership was mature to understand. And remember, it's a double-edged game. You start empowering citizens, it can become a snake that can turn around and bite you. It's a big political risk that somebody is taking when you want to empower citizens, because Indian elections were won or lost based on disempowered citizenship. You just had to come in and vote. You didn't have to do anything else. You can't think, you can't ask questions. But today, we have a situation where citizens are actively encouraged to speak. They're actively encouraged to engage. You have MyGov platforms, you have Pragati platforms, you have platforms using technology. You have a lot of mechanisms in which you can actually talk to the Prime Minister in different ways, and whether you can tweet, you can actually challenge people. And so that's something which looks like very difficult to believe. I'll just give a small example, a very on-the-street example which nobody talks about. Indian civilian awards, like anywhere else in the world, right up to the Nobel Prize, every award is lobbied for. So the people who have the right amount of advocacy potential, the right amount of lobbyist capacity get those awards. But in India, the last 5 years, Indian civilian awards, close to 30% of the awards have gone to people who are unsung, unheard of. People who nobody even knew where they were, but they were actually performing quietly in the service of the nation. Some mechanism where ordinary citizens could nominate their own fellow citizens, and that would be verified. That would be actually, if it's proved true, the state would actually honor them with a civilian award, which was unthinkable 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You actually had to know somebody. I was nominated for a civilian award 20, 25 years ago. I didn't even know it. And suddenly I got a call from Delhi to distant Mysore, because I lived in a forest with indigenous communities, so they thought I was deserving of an award. And I got a phone call saying, somehow somebody in the government thought I was fit enough to be nominated. But the person calls me and says, you know what, we have done a job, we think we picked the right guy, but now you got to do your job and lobby the Prime Minister's office, you'll get the award. And I actually laughed it off at that point of time. And fast forwarding it 20, 25 years down the line, you can actually nominate a citizen today and get your voice heard and get somebody to respond to it. I'm giving a very small example of citizen engagement. You can actually go onto the MyGov platform. If you're pissed off with the government, you're angry with the government, you have a suggestion for the government, actually give it and be noticed. So I think citizen engagement, the pressure that the authorizing environment is putting on the system, self-invited pressure, the government itself invites this pressure. You cannot even imagine that the Prime Minister of the nation calling the Indian citizens to actually give inputs for his speech on the Independence Day. It's so difficult to even think these things can happen, and they're actually happening today. So I believe this narrative of powerful citizen engagement, very quiet, subtle, silent way of doing it, is indicating to the rest of the country and to the rest of the world that democracy might be noisy in India, but is actually evolving. Evolving to the point where an enlightened citizenship, which is moving away from entitlement to empowerment, citizenship which is actually moving away from absolute civic indifference to civic compliance. No, you should live in India to understand this. 10 years ago, if I found somebody throwing garbage on the street, and I went and told him, what are you doing? Why are you throwing garbage on the street? He would say, it's none of your business. That would be his classical answer. Today, if the same person is throwing garbage on the street, all I have to say is Swachh Bharat and just say this. The fellow is so guilty and embarrassed, he actually apologizes and goes away. So that is a huge shift in thinking. To me, shifting ordinary citizens, their behavioral patterns, and making them think that I can no longer be civic indifferent, but I got to be civic engaged and compliant, itself is a big movement forward. And I'm sure if this momentum continues, it'll really grow. So from a rights-based approach to a responsibility-based approach, from a indifference to compliance, from entitlement to empowerment, I think the shifting narrative of citizen engagement, this authorizing environment, which is powerfully shifting, is the greatest contribution of the political leadership. So it's not the 7%, 8% growth. If India continues to democratize development as it is doing today, the kind of inclusiveness in development today, the kind of narratives we have in human development, which is shifting, to the real capacity of building human and social capital, whether it's affirmation for the poor that was discussed in the previous session, or it is Stand Up India, Startup India. I actually help facilitate 12 to 14 of my tribal indigenous women living in the middle of a forest to set up a food processing unit. They could access all the facilities that was created for them, and today they're proud owners of that unit themselves. Something unthinkable that could happen is actually happening. And if thousands of such examples are aggregated, just imagine the power of change. Now, all this in any country is work in progress. I know we all live in a world of control, alt, delete, and we think you do that, you'll have a new government tomorrow, a new powerful change tomorrow. Social change is decadal. Behavioral change is much more decadal. So we need a lot of decades for these kind of things to become part of the national DNA. But the greatest contribution is to fashion a new narrative, a new India, which is actually being fashioned, have the political courage and the will to actually do something about it, encourage citizens to engage and participate, build institutions for the reframed rules to deliver on those rules. I think these are the unsung, unheard of stories of India. And this is what democratic experts should need to study and understand. And this can be replicated. That is the model the world needs today. A model which is actually driven by positivism, positive energies of citizens engaging, and rather than all the negative stories that we see. If you truly want to live in a world which can be a great place for all of us to fashion together, I think democratizing development is the only way to go. And India today has got powerful stories to tell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So from the entitled citizen to the empowered citizen, from a rights-based approach to a responsibility-based approach. That's very interesting, very powerful. And now let me turn to Dan Twining. Dan not only has extensive experience in India, but also as president of International Republican Institute has devoted considerable thought to the question of what makes democracy work and what the obstacles are. So Dan.
Thank you, Todd. I'm delighted to be here with Aparna and so many colleagues and friends. And I would just like to thank the first panelist. That was really powerful and compelling, and I think gives us a very different way to think about and look at India, kind of below the headlines. So thank you. I'm not going to try to replicate the conversations you've been having, including this one, about the miracle of India's democracy in terms of its internal politics and pluralism. I would like to frame my 7 or 8 minutes around how India is governed versus how so much of its neighborhood is governed, and draw the connections so that we can better understand, I think, the Indian genius, but also better understand what is happening in the world today. Because India and its neighborhood is a microcosm in terms of this great struggle that we see emerging between the free world and authoritarian revisionist powers that want to build new spheres of influence that are hierarchical rather than open and pluralistic. This struggle is underway in the world. I think many countries are coming at it in zigzag fashion. Many, including our government in the United States, are struggling to understand what this new era of geopolitical and ideological competition mean. But in fact, the question of India's democracy and America's democracy, the health and functioning of our democracies, is in fact tied up with the broader struggles underway in the world around what is the best way to govern people, what is the best way to empower citizens, what is the best way to deliver economic modernization and broad-based prosperity. And for the first time in perhaps 30 years, there is a real debate underway about that, given the, shall we say, under-effectiveness of many democracies, given the perceived success of China's model of authoritarian development, given some of the other stresses underway in the world today. So my first point is that this struggle exists. It's something we're all grappling with in our own societies. We all have authoritarians in our own societies, but it's also something happening at a macro, at a systemic level. And the challenge, one of the key challenges, is that open societies are much more vulnerable in this contest than are more closed autocratic regimes. Open societies are so vulnerable because we have freedom of information, because we have freedom of political competition, because our polities can be atomized and fragmented by extreme voices on social media, just to take one example, by foreign influence and disinformation operations. So we, the democracies, are subject to these pressures. And it's worth thinking about how to enhance the resilience of our democracies. So that would be point one. I only have 5. Point 2 is that India really, I think, presents a very compelling example for so many countries. Americans are very lucky. We're geographically isolated. We're in some ways energy independent. We are prosperous. Most countries do not have those attributes, right? Most countries are somewhere on the development trajectory, trying to move up it, grappling with real world problems of poverty, of inclusion, of extremism, of marginalization. India presents, I think, perhaps the most compelling example, certainly in the developing world, of how to grapple with the problems of modernity in a democratic and open framework, so that Indians can best resolve their problems and chart that development pathway ahead for themselves. Now, the Chinese model, of course, looks very different. The model of hierarchical authoritarian control, the model where only one party and really only one man has an absolute say in the affairs of this vast country, like India, many more than 1 billion people. There are 2 real-world experiments playing out today around what is the right way to develop, what is the right way to meet citizens' needs, what is the right way to have a greater voice and say in world affairs. India and China are not necessarily competing directly against each other in every dimension, but I think many of us look to them as examples of this struggle I have been talking about. And so India's model of pluralism, of inclusivity, of decentralization, ultra-federalism, I think is very compelling. And the fact that India has emerged as the world's fastest growing big economy, I would argue is heartening. It has some way to go, but it's heartening. Point 3, the dangers to India do not emanate from the democracies. The dangers to India, to the security of Indian people, emanate from either autocracies or misgoverned components in their neighborhood. That misgovernance or authoritarian control are the fundamental challenges to India's security in South Asia, in Asia more widely, in its wider region. You, of course, have China with its territorial ambitions in India, its challenge to the Indian model, but also directly to India's sovereignty in the form of Indian territory that China claims as its own. Of course, in Pakistan, you have a democratic state with kind of a military security overlay built into governing structures, which presents foundational challenges for the prospects of peace in South Asia. In Bangladesh, you have democracy, but you really also have a system in which one party has been dominant and has used its power to erode political competition, right? To close political space in ways that are detrimental to pluralism and inclusivity and that have frankly bred, I'm afraid, more violent extremism rather than less. That's a challenge to India. In Sri Lanka, you had, at least under the Rajapaksa regime, a country that pivoted to China, did a set of quite corrupt and dodgy dealings that hosted Chinese submarine visits and other things. The corrosion of Sri Lanka's democracy in that period had very detrimental effects on India's security, just like the corrosion of governance in the Maldives under the previous regime of Mr. Yamin had very corrosive effects on India's security. We can go into detail on all things, we don't need to. But I would add also Myanmar, the Rohingya crisis, which really is quite desperate, as well as the fact that the government in Myanmar is turning back to Beijing after this big opening in 2011, 2012, in which it was trying to pivot away from too much Chinese control. This government is now pivoting back because it is under pressure from Western and other democracies around its own inability to provide citizen security at home to its Rohingya population. So these are all security dangers, problems, core challenges for India emanating from the state of governance around India. Point 4, I would just also roll in here China's Belt and Road Initiative, which does encircle India on land and sea. I don't think that's its intention or its only intention, but it does. China is building a network not just of infrastructure, but of political influence, of military access, of in some cases corrupt dealings with politicians in so many of these countries, politicians and other elites. And that provides a real challenge to India and presents, I think, foundational concerns for Indian national security decision makers around their freedom of movement and their ability to operate in the Indo-Pacific. I would argue that India is probably not going to outbuild infrastructure. It's not going to outbuild China in infrastructure, but Indian support for the soft infrastructure of accountability, transparency, rule of law, open tenders, these things would be very helpful, will continue to be helpful in mitigating some of the corrosive effects, the corrupting influence of some of the Belt and Road activities. Finally, 5, these are all pretty basic points. India's most important partners in world affairs are democracies, right? I was living in Delhi in 2006, and it was great because an MEA document of an Indian Ministry of External Affairs document leaked and was on the front pages of the Hindustan Times. And this is a good lesson what never to do if you're a government official. It listed the 10 most important countries to India's future. This was in 2006. And I'm recreating the list by head, so I'm not going to get them all right. But it was essentially the United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, and I'm trying to think what number 5 might have been. Canada, Germany, Australia. Down at the bottom of that list were Russia, China, and Pakistan. And I think they were on that list for more negative reasons than positive reasons, right? Because one can be important for negative reasons, not just positive reasons. But I will conclude just with the thought that, of course, India's interests lie not just with the democracies, but in sustaining a world in which it can rise as successfully as China has risen, a world that's based on rules, a world that's based on resolving conflicts peacefully, a world that's based on open access, a world that's based on sovereignty and pluralism, that's not hierarchical, that does not try to recreate new middle kingdoms, the kind of world that allows India to truly enjoy strategic autonomy as it rises as a great democracy.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. That's great. Resilience, grappling openly with the question of development, realization that the dangers to India do not come from democracies, but rather from governance issues, authoritarian neighbors, the special challenge posed by Belt and Road, and then the thought that that India has long recognized that its most important partners internationally are democracies. Let me turn to Dr. Balu, and let me ask, this was a presentation of India in its strategic context, in its in the context of regional politics, rivalries, et cetera. What is the level of engagement, of citizen engagement with these kinds of issues in India at the moment, and what should it be?
It's very difficult to say what kind of engagement would ordinary citizens have in larger strategic issues that Dan was outlining about. I think it's more easy. Right now, I would see it this way, it's an evolutionary progression. And right now, the engagement is everyday survival issues. So people are talked about cleanliness, about hygiene, about talking to the state, engaging with the state, raising complaints, creating grievance portals, actually accessing banking systems, and looking at their own economic growth and at the personalized level, looking at progress for themselves, which I think is the beginning of the narrative. So I think once that level of, it's something like the Maslow's hierarchy, once that level is satisfied, maybe they'll start looking outward. But opportunities have arisen where China's transgression into Arunachal Pradesh, and that creates a national debate, and sometimes media fashions the debate, sometimes public pressure fashions the media debate. And I think those are opportunities when citizens are engaging on a debate discourse level. I don't think it's an action level. The other things are all at an action level. Some of the things are at the debate discourse level, and they happen at multiple layers now. If it's in Delhi or some major group like this or a discourse like this, it's more academic or more, I would say, a lot of noise but very benign as far as citizen engagement is concerned. 8 or 10 active citizens are only engaging the dialogue. But when something like Swachh Bharat or simple things like Jan Dhan Yojana or the challenges of Aadhaar have actually had different levels of citizen engagement. Now, I would think I'm not able to remember or recollect any major national policy except Aadhaar, which actually had enormous debate across the country for a sustainedly long period of time, to the point where even the Supreme Court had to intervene based on public interest litigations. So I think the level of engagement is different. Some are action-based, some are discourse debate-based, and even the discourse debate is very sometimes minimalistic or sometimes a little more engaging. But strategic importance, I think it will start happening after some time if this kind of citizen support continues.
So it's essentially a bottom-up process of engagement that begins with the sort of basic issues, the microeconomic issues of your life, of how you experience it, of how you relate to the governance of the country in specific cases, and as that continues to develop, we can expect a sort of greater degree of engagement on the part of citizens. Well, Dan, let me ask. I don't know. Does IRI have a presence in India?
So
as a mature democracy? Yeah.
So IRI, I should say. So we're a democracy development organization. We're working around the world to help strengthen democracy, work with democratic actors and parties and institutions. In India doesn't need any of our help with its democracy. That's for Indians. But one great initiative we are rolling out in India in coming weeks, the Belfer Center at Harvard developed a cybersecurity campaign playbook. And the genius of this project is it's led by Hillary Clinton's campaign manager in 2016 and Mitt Romney's campaign manager in 2012. So it's entirely bipartisan. These are high-level political operatives who saw the disruptive effects of disinformation and forms of interference in our political campaigns. So IRI and our sister institute, NDI, with the Belfer Center, have internationalized this campaign cybersecurity playbook. And we are about to roll it out in India for Indian political parties and campaign activists on how to protect your campaign, how to define and identify misinformation, disinformation, how to ensure the security, the integrity of your political operation in a country. We are rolling this out in India. We're rolling it out in Indonesia before their elections. We've already rolled it out in Europe in advance of the European Parliament elections. This goes to the point I was making earlier about the vulnerability of open societies in this age of disinformation, of extreme content online, the amplification of extreme voices that in previous eras would not have had such a platform. And of course, those extreme voices can be sponsored from abroad as well as domestically.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Is there a one of the objectives, I think, that in some of the Russian operations that were conducted here was just basically to drive wedges in populations, to push people apart. We've talked a little bit, Dr. Balu has, about the great diversity, obviously, of the Indian population. So you would think that could potentially be a source of vulnerability. In other words, in addition to the things that are driving citizen engagement and bringing it forward, have there been any indications of active forces trying to drive matters apart, whether they're coming from abroad or perhaps even internally?
I'm just quoting people who can't be quoted.
Okay.
So that's absolutely true for any country. I think always every country has got its own personalized agendas, their own national interests, which always means interfering in other countries' interests. And I think India is not insulated from it. I know a lot of Indian economic interests have been targeted in different ways. I know some 15, 20 years ago, a very senior civil servant in India shared this with me. That's why I said it's a little about how the Indian fishing industry was growing and maturing, and how the global fishing industry didn't like India's fishing industry to stand up. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Indian system at that time, and the Indian system is pretty vulnerable because corruption in high places was a reality those days, in which laws or policies actually were not made. The beauty of policy making is not making policies also policy, right? And so, and sometimes when you don't make policies, you can actually give in to those interests. There have been very clearly documented evidences of how when the nuclear issue, when the India-US nuclear doctrine was being signed, and I come from the non-profit sector, and I know how the Indian non-profit sector operates, we have vested interest in that sector, which actually fall prey to this kind of international games. So I think India is not really insulated, but last 10 years, I wouldn't just say this government, people have woken up to this possibility. We have had situations where legislative assistance were provided to parliamentarians in the name of saying it's not parliamentarians, they're not idiots. They're intelligent people who get elected to offices of power. And why do you need legislative assistance funded by international agencies, specifically trying to alter or tutor the nature of policy making in India? But before much damage was done, the Indian government woke up to this fact and actually got it all removed. So I think in some sense, this kind of meddling is a reality. It's never going to stop. And now you have better, more and more sophisticated tools for doing it. Cambridge Analytica was used by Indian political parties too. It is not as though Indian political parties were insulated from it. So I think these are realities that we got to deal with in the days of technology. And that's why this kind of cybersecurity tools are also a reality which India has to use. And so it might be a very useful thing to be used. So I don't think any country can be insulated. It's only enlightened information available to possibly groups of people who can negate or renegotiate situations when such things happen.
Tell me a little bit about the development of social media in India and what role it plays in this process of increasing citizen engagement.
India is a marketeer's delight for social media, right? We've had challenges. We've had, one incident of lynching in some corner of the country, or one incident of some religious tension that can prevail, can actually be mass supplied to the whole country with disastrous effects. And we have seen that. And so now I think all the social media companies have been invited by the government and asked to self-regulate and make sure that they manage the fake media campaigns. WhatsApp, I think the first country where it piloted it out is you can't forward a message for more than 5 people now in India. I think that's been tested in India. It's now getting spread to other countries too. So the social media companies are waking up. Facebook has woken up. And now Google, Facebook, and I think somebody else recently got together the Indian government and came up with a plan which said that how they're going to maintain and contain fake news in India, that especially in the background of the elections that are going to come. So social media is a very powerful tool. I think the largest users of social media, maybe in terms of content and population, would be, I don't know about China, I don't have numbers, but it would possibly be India. You have more smartphones in India than you can ever imagine 5 years ago. So every young man has got it. My indigenous tribal women in the middle of the forest are able to transact bank transactions using their smartphones, the UPI app which government has brought out. And so you're sort of forced to be computer literate now. The system is pressurizing you to learn stuff. And I think in that environment, social media is a reality we have to live with. And how do we deal? I would always look at it positively. Can we use it for something extraordinary? We know in disaster situations, India has deployed it very effectively. It's been very effectively used by our field health workers in monitoring and tracking pregnant women and caring for pregnant women. So I think it's a very powerful opportunity into looking at the negatives which are going to be there anyway. Can we build on the positives?
Yeah. Dan, let me turn to you for a moment and ask you to talk a little bit more about the broader threat that you see authoritarian societies opposing authoritarian countries, authoritarian governments, I should say. Let's not blame the people for the conditions of their under which their rulers make them live. But this broader challenge that you mentioned, the idea that there is a renewed sense of competition between between autocratically governed states and democratically governed states, and frankly one in which the democratically governed states have not necessarily been winning over the past couple of years. There have been some interesting and difficult times. The notion that democracy was on an ineluctable march through the globe is an idea whose time seems to have gone. Where do we stand on this?
I will start by looking in the mirror and just making the point that democracies have been underperforming, under-delivering in many places. And so I think there are real challenges and dangers we can attribute to authoritarian influence, to foreign interference that is malign and hostile, that is disruptive. But the reality is that the health of democracies at the end of the day is in the hand of our own citizens, right? I think that's just a foundational point. That said, when our US Director of National Intelligence testified before Congress just 10 days or so ago, he made the point that authoritarian great powers are colluding. They are collaborating quite actively to weaken and undermine democracy and undermine alliances between democracies. In the National Defense Strategy that Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis shepherded during his tenure, on the first page, I think in the first sentence of the executive summary, it says Russia and China are working actively, including together, to project their authoritarian model in order to advance their particular interests in eroding, weakening, subverting this open rules-based order that has been in existence since 1945 in some ways, since the end of the Cold War in others. So this is not the NGO community, right? This is the US Secretary of Defense, this is US Director of National Intelligence, identifying a security threat from authoritarian collaboration. And I just think we have to take that quite seriously. We're seeing it play out today in Venezuela. That's not the subject of this meeting, but if I could just do 10 seconds. In Venezuela, the core international prop that is sustaining Mr. Maduro in power, he is in power illegally in violation of the Venezuelan constitution written by Hugo Chavez. The international consortium that is sustaining him in power right now is led by Moscow and Beijing. I think the Chinese are getting queasy about this because they are perhaps more sophisticated in realizing that their economic interests are not dependent on one man in Venezuela. But you are actually seeing this at work in real time in the Western Hemisphere in America's backyard, which is quite alarming. I'm looking at my notes. Oh yes, I can't read my own handwriting. I'll just mention maybe one or two other examples. China and Russia are doing this in different ways. They both, I think, have defined an interest in weakening and subverting democratic order and democratic alliances. Putin and the Kremlin are doing this in highly disruptive ways, in ways that assault Western democracies very directly, in ways that interfere very grossly in our internal affairs through things like election meddling, in our elections, in German elections, in French elections, in Canadian elections. I was just in Canada last week, and Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet are really seized with the imminent dangers of Russian meddling in the Canadian elections. This is a center-left government. So this is not an ideological thing. This is not workers of the world unite. It is about disruption. It is about weakening the West. It is about undermining the rules-based order. China is, I think, doing something somewhat different. I think perhaps also dangerous to democratic order, certainly, but that is perhaps a little more subtle. And I will say, last thing on China, we saw this play out in Australia. No, Australia is not the Maldives or Nepal or a little country in the developing world. Australia is a rich democracy that discovered extraordinary degrees of Chinese political influence, malign interference in its domestic politics through donations to politicians, by having politicians repeating Chinese talking points on issues like the South China Sea. It turns out there was Chinese money supporting their political campaigns. Chinese agents embedded in their governing systems. And so Australia, this is on my mind because I just had an Australian visitor this morning. Australia, I think, is struggling very actively with the fact that Chinese interests had really penetrated its democracy and is now putting in motion a whole set of laws and regulatory regimes to try to manage that. But this is something that every one of us is confronting in our own ways.
Dr. Bali, one of the things that has sometimes been said of India is that India has been very concerned with Indian democracy, but not terribly interested in the condition of other people's democracy or in being a kind of what I think Dan would welcome, which would be a force for the promotion of democracy. And some of that, I'm sure, is well, I grew up in the 1970s in Chicago, and Chicago was always had this sort of second city sense of itself. It was not New York, it was not the West Coast, it was not Hollywood, but nevertheless there was enough politics in Chicago to keep Chicago happy. The local news was as rich as you could get. And sometimes when I think about India, I think there's so much India there that maybe the impulse has been just to stick to what's going on at home and be focused there. And yet we do face these broader international challenges.
I think India inherited from its independence the very idea of non-aligned movement, which said that I'm going to only focus on myself and not align with anybody. It's sort of, I'm nowhere, but I'm everywhere kind of a thinking, but you're actually nowhere. And so you became a nobody too. But I think things have changed. If you look at, it's sometimes, I always wonder, it's damned if I do, damned if I don't. Like within India, our prime minister is criticized for taking India to a global stage, right? He's been traveling so much and India is known everywhere today. India is a buzzword, and I think that credit goes to the current government, which actually has gone around. It might not have actually dabbled in issues of the other countries, but it's actually made India visible. And maybe if India becomes a success story, it's an imitatable democracy then. So I think in that sense, it's something that which we would like to live and show. I'm not sure what is on the government's mind. I can't speak on behalf of the government, but at least I know that Indian democracy is a model in a sense. Look at it, India, we have had we just had the largest party in power in India in terms of number of states, etc., lose 3 major states, and the transition of power is so quiet and smooth and seamless. Can you ever imagine this happening in any other country so easily, with no whimper of anything? Even in the United States, every presidential election in the last many years has seen so much of challenges, right? But in India, the Delhi powerhouse, a major shift for the country. They lost 2 electoral Lok Sabha seats in a place where they would never have lost. No problems in transition. 3 major states out of 5 states, no problems in transition. So I think these are lessons that the other countries who need to watch and learn and understand how power can get so seamlessly moved from one party to the other, despite being very bitter political rivals in the elections. So I think by walking the talk, India can be an imitatable model. So it's sometimes better if we don't go around tom-tomming everywhere and say, I'm going to give this democracy model to everybody, but just let the message spread on its own.
Thanks very much. Yeah. I think we have plenty of time for some discussion. So, and I don't know if we have microphones coming around or
we could hear them. I think.
Yeah, we'll. Yes, please. There we go. Sorry.
My question around that centers around understanding and knowing, and if you can add, both of our speakers here can add value to the fact that we would like to know. I would like to know about your views on the protectionist measures, India, because that is not separate from what you just said, Mr. Subramaniam. That yes, India is visible, but keeping in mind that every day you hear about protectionist measures. How much of that is true from your point of view? And Dan, you can also provide us an insight on that too. Thank you.
Let Dan take off first.
All right.
No, I just say, I spent time when I was younger studying the East Asian miracle of how South Korea, Taiwan, etc., opened up and there are different lessons for India, but I think the core challenge for India is to connect to the global economy in the way that all these Asian tiger economies did, starting with Japan after the Pacific War, running through South Korea, Taiwan, into Southeast Asia, China, kind of the third or fourth wave of that. India is at a point where it has one of the world's biggest internal markets, but one of my Indian friends laments the new protectionism that is not simply an Indian phenomenon, that is also a Western phenomenon, that China used this very dramatic period of globalization and openness from the 80s through the 2000s to take off. And protectionist pressures imposed by the Indian system, but also imposed by the retreat of global economic openness since the global financial crisis, actually will harm India more, because India had not yet gotten to that point where it could benefit, like China did, from global supply chains, that global connectivity.
I am understanding your question specifically from the trade point of view, right? Trade and manufacturing. Now, we'll have to understand the Indian economy. Like, most of the Indian economy is driven by the primary sector. For a long time, it was driven by it's a very inefficient primary sector in India, the land-based economies. Though we have the largest cultivable land, but in terms of efficiency, we are not as efficient in producing per capita, whatever, per ton of grains. The manufacturing economy was actually stagnant. The agriculture economy was possibly not growing at all or negative sometimes. The manufacturing economy is stagnant. India's real economic boom happened by the tertiary sector, by the software, the hospitality, and all those kind of sectors. That's a sector which the knowledge economy could sustain. But the manufacturing economy was a real place where jobs could be created. And so I think it is not just a political narrative, but it's also an economic imperative for countries to look a little more inwards. But that being said, nowhere in the entire thinking and design, as I understood, as an outsider, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government because I'm not part of the government. I'm just looking at it as an outsider and doing my analysis. The whole point was, how do you actually kickstart Indian manufacturing, but also use the global connections and networks and reachability? So Make in India was not an exclusion of anything else. It was always a partnership where you would actually buy technology, but invite the people to also participate in training and embedding that technology within the Indian context. And so in a sense, it was sort of, I would say, a qualified protectionism, where you're actually open, but you're also open enough to understand that we thought that you can't do much. But you're also closed enough in saying that if I just let be too open, then my people don't benefit actually. So it's not just about goods and services being manufactured outside, looking at India as a market, but looking at India as a market along with looking at India as a manufacturing base. And that is a shift you're seeing today, whether it's defense, whether it is industrial manufacturing, that's a big shift you're seeing. And I think it's possibly the kind of protectionism that we can live with.
Would you see that as a kind of globalization management strategy that's specific to India?
I would not say that it's specific to India because I've not really, I haven't studied other countries, but I think India is possibly strategically using it to its advantage right now because we have a huge intellectual talent. We have the world's youngest country, 78% of Indians are less than 40. We have the least dependency ratios in the world. China's dependency window is gone. The democratic dividend is gone for China. India has got the democratic dividend. And so if you have an educated population with no jobs, that's a real threat to democracy. So we really want young people to be engaged. And so I think to that extent, protectionism is welcome because you're actually engaging people and keeping them happy and involved.
Can I just add, because this is such an important question, I'm so glad you asked. I think India, there's a unique moment for India now. The international business community is really souring or has soured on the China market, given political risk, given IPR theft, tech transfer problems. There is a real opportunity for India to become that new manufacturing hub financed by foreign direct investment. So this is not hot money that comes and goes. This is actually foreign companies coming and building plants in India that employ lots of Indians. India has this enormous employment challenge. It's not meeting it. The last numbers I saw this week were that it's creating, 5 million jobs a year, and it needs to create at least 12, that million jobs a month dynamic. So I think there's a moment here for India to buck the protectionist trend and integrate with global markets and be that new base that China was. And it will work better for India, given rule of law, given property rights, given the quality of Indian democracy, than it worked for the international community in China.
Only thing we need to possibly do, the work in progress is a little bit of labor reforms, a little bit of faster sort of hasten and expedite the contractual management judicial processes, I think then we could get there.
Yes, please.
Raju Kutsrekar, you mentioned about the Belt and Road Initiative, and there have been a lot of issues there. Though I wouldn't say that there are certainly certain benefits there for the countries receiving countries. But my question is, in the past, there used to be the multinational development banks and Paris Club, etc., where there was a dispute resolution mechanism, or also to some degree the checks and balances on corruption of the governments that to reduce any kind of shoddy deals. So my question is, how would the US and India respond to this sort of closed contract mechanism, rather than just hand-wringing and saying, oh, this is foul?
I thought it was meant for you. Because you're more the expert on that than I am.
I'm not an expert. I would say the Belt and Road investments have brought some benefits in the form of infrastructure, but I think citizens and politicians in these countries need to know what they're signing up for, right? You have a new government in the Maldives that has just discovered it's stuck in an enormous pile of debt. Multi-billion-dollar pile of debt. The Maldives is a country of like 400,000 people. So this may, I haven't done the math, this may be the highest debt to per capita ratio in the world, right? In Sri Lanka, we know what happened with Hambantota Port. Sri Lankan citizens do not support that. We have seen again and again in Malaysia, a new government took power, opened the books, discovered lots of corrupt practices associated with Belt and Road financing, froze those investments, and is now trying to renegotiate them. So I think your point, correct. Lots of countries need infrastructure. China can build it. But India's principles laid out, I think, in its inaugural statement 2 years ago about how it would engage with the Belt and Road Summit and the Belt and Road Project. Open tender, fair and competitive contracting and bidding, all of these things that have not been happening in Belt and Road contracts. And I think politicians in many countries are becoming increasingly aware.
I would just add to that. Belt and Road is, I'm not really done much study on it, but I know it's economic slavery for many countries now. It's going to be embedded with economic slavery. But that being said, India's contractual management system, if you look at the kind of roads that India is building right now, the infrastructure that's on in a big way, the per day, per kilometer coverage of roads is the highest in post-independent India. That itself speaks enormously about the contractual maturation of the contract management systems now.
Thanks. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think this is a wonderful conference. And just look at this literature by ICCR. The statements are brief, but it's wonderful. I think everybody should take a look at it. But the problem now is that let's get back to the democracy itself. How the India really establish your society by good legislation and a good implementation. Because in America, so far as I know, and in capitalist country like USA or France, I think the problem is that they use the money to get the best bid and also rob people's money in order to get the most money for influence. So if by doing this, I don't think they can really totally say India can be isolated without being corrupted. So it's an implementation of the law and then that kind of governance. How do you really establish that so that people can really establish your strong social value or cultural value and pride without being corrupted by that outside influence? So the voters is really mean something rather than more of the number is non-voters.
I don't know if I understood the question. Would you like to help me understand it?
Well, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is how do you really institutionalize the fight against corruption in order to ensure the integrity of the system? Am I close?
You should have a good legislation rather than bad legislation. Bad legislation means influenced by the money, whether within
Okay.
India or
That's good.
from
So the question
USA.
then is there, how much is money exerting undue influence on legislation, on internal governance processes in India? Is that true? And B, is it a risk? And C, if it is a risk, is it increasing?
Let me, as I understood your question, coming from the policy space, I think allied capture of policy is a reality in all democracies. I don't think any country is immune or insulated from it. And so we can't escape the fact that the more you have space for voice, you can actually buy and create and manufacture voices. And so I think the last I remember when I was a student at the Kennedy School many, many years ago, is that Washington, D.C. alone has got something like 50,000 registered lobbyists. There's a city of Washington, D.C. Obviously, they're lobbying for something. So in different ways, you capture voices, and India is not immune to it. So if I were to look at the way Indian business captures voices, I would use one simple indicator. It's very difficult because nobody's privy to this data, because this kind of influences don't happen in the open market. They happen very surreptitiously, and India doesn't legitimize lobbying, so we don't know how it happens. But at least I would go by the crony capitalism index. It's a standard measure used to understand how much of crony capitalism exists. When the current government took charge, 12% of India's GDP was considered to be the crony capitalism indicator. And right now it's 4%. So if 12% can fall to 4%, it very clearly indicates that the crony capitalists don't have much to do. And if you remember Surjit Balaji's talk in the morning, where he was talking about a small percentage of people who are very unhappy with the current government because they are the ones who are getting disadvantaged more and more and more. When more and more tax compliance happen. Recently, India passed a law called Fugitive Economic Offenders Law. It passed the Insolvency Act, a lot of new acts, which is, in my opinion, political suicide in the electoral battles. They've actually had the courage to pass them. Means that those people are not going to be happy. Those people who could fund Indian elections are not going to be happy anymore. And so to me, it's a welcome sign, and India has actually had the courage to do it. And so only indicator I would use right now is the crony capitalism index, and then talk about how it's definitely good news for us. But beyond that, I would be a fool or too naive to say that Indian politics, as much as any other politics anywhere else in the world, is immune from money, it's immune from cronyism, it's immune from business interest. Policies are captured by the elite, whether it is economical elite or otherwise. I think the reality exists.
Dan, let me turn to you on this as well, because it might be helpful to have a comparative perspective. It's not really the job of IRI or your counterpart, the National Democratic Institute, to comment particularly on American politics, but there have been many observations about the very important role that money plays here as well. And I think obviously when the subject comes up, we at least owe an account of how we're doing on these matters, as well as asking how other people are doing.
Thank you. The U.S. question is very interesting in a historical context because the founding fathers of the United States were actually quite obsessed with the dangers of plutocratic politics and also with the danger of foreign corruption. When the United States was founded, it was a set of little colonies on the east coast of the United States, living in a world of European great powers, which were imperial and had global projection capabilities. And our founders and their predecessors understood that money power from the old world could come in and corrupt and subvert America's democratic republic. So this is not a new issue in our politics. It's actually a very old issue in our politics. It's always been there. I think it will always be there in our country and in all democracies, in all countries. One difference between democracies and other systems is that people do not go into government to get rich. Those of us who have worked in government can attest that one doesn't get rich by working in government. One actually often has the opposite effect. This is not true in autocracies. I don't know what Maduro is worth, but I bet it's going to be a lot when we find out. We have seen estimates that Vladimir Putin is worth $95 billion, billion with a B. I mean, that's bigger than the GDP of some countries, right? Xi Jinping took power in China on a very strong anti-corruption platform. We know from what has come out of some of those investigations and persecutions that many Chinese elites and their families had become very rich. This is in the Workers' Party, the Communist Party of China, that being a Mandarin in China was a sure ticket to material wealth. I could go on, but I think I would just make the point that democracies do have some checks and balances and accountability built into them that autocracies do not.
That's great. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm glad I stuck around because I really enjoyed it. You spoke a lot about citizen engagement, and I think one of the crucial parts of that is youth engagement. And we do have a large percentage of youth in India, like us, who are willing to and want to be engaged in political debates or discourse. But there's been a recent crackdown on university professors and students who kind of dare to speak up against the current government. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Being the space of academic research, I would actually ask for evidence. There are instances, and what happens is when these instances get written about, spoken about, and amplified, we think that's happening everywhere. There are 4 specific students and 2 universities when this happened. But let's look at the 500, 600 other universities. Let's look at students across the campuses. Let's look at 58% of India being less than 20 years old. So if you look at actual numbers in real objective sense, I think that's actually flourishing of democracy, that students actually speak up, even if it's just 4 voices. But what doesn't get highlighted in media is around 50 other voices who are speaking. Because what gets really picked up is anti-establishment voices. And the moment you speak a pro-establishment voice, I don't carry a flag for anybody. I just look at evidence, data, and then talk about it. And my view is, as much as I welcome dissent and expression of different opinions, I would also welcome media actually taking an unbiased stand and actually presenting counterpoints of view and what's happening everywhere else in every other system, in every other university or every other student activism kind of a situation. I at least attended, every year I engage with nothing less than 200,000 young people in India, in different forums, big conferences to small interactions. And the energy that I'm impressed with, the kind of activism that they have, the number of policy engagement that they want to get involved in. I'll give a small example. I run a policy boot camp in Delhi, which runs over 3 weeks or so. I'm part of that system which runs it. And the best of Indian, from the IITs and the national law schools and the IIMs apply to it. 150 get selected, but thousands apply. And the kind of energy they bring to the table. I at least get every year at least more than 1,000 emails how to get into public policy institutions across the world and how do we get admission into it. So I see all this as a very, very good maturation of Indian democracy. If the young people can actually have, want to have formal spaces in which to express voices. Now that being said, like in every other country, there are a lot of barriers for active political engagement. Policy engagement is one thing. Electorally engaging in politics is another thing completely. And that is where the problem is. Only those young people whose parents are also in politics get easy access and entry into politics. For ordinary people, the barriers are too much. And so we need to really work on democracy and to see that how does even those young people who aspire to be politicians tomorrow, what kind of spaces you can create. So I think this crackdown or this shutting out of voices, the same 4 names, give me 400 names. We are 1.3 billion people. Let's look at numbers in the right perspective, right? And if 58% are less than 20, we must have an equal proportion of people who are getting subdued or not allowed to spoken about or speak about, right? So I think we need to really look at and not carry the same media narratives, but look at the counter narratives which are not getting fashioned at all because they're just allowed to. That's the way it is, and that's the way they let it be.
Is that a failure, to fashion a counter narrative, or I know it's very fashionable to speak of narratives these days, but how about just to tell the truth about what's going on?
I think it's a failure. I would strongly say it's a real failure because we are really discounting voices of young people. We're discounting the reality that exists there, and we're only promoting voices with what people want to be talking about. So I think, I don't know, every political party which is possibly might lose by this narrative not being fashioned or gain by the narrative getting fashioned, they have to wake up and start talking about it.
Let me pose a question. What is the view in India of the Indian diaspora and of Indians who are living in the United States in particular?
Yeah. It's sort of a personalized question because my whole family lives in North America. So, but I live in India. So a lot of people ask me, I teach at Cornell, so I just come here and go back. I'm always happy going back. People ask me, how does it feel? I always say that it was very good that the Indian diaspora came here at the time they came in. Like, I chose not to come in. I graduated from medicine from my class. 100 of us got into medicine. Around 95 of us graduated. 65 of us landed up in the United States. Wow. So either United States or London were the two destinations for most of my classmates. And I worked in the forest, and I always told my classmates, you stay where you are because you write your checks. That's how I get supported for my work. So Indian diaspora was seen as check writers. They're seen as promoting the microeconomy of their families. But they also, I believe there are much more bigger advantages we missed. One was Indian diaspora set aspirational standards for a lot of people back home in India. They were exposed to different value systems in the United States. It could be democracy, it could be understanding of fairness and justice and rule of law and other things, which put pressure on the Indian system back home. And India has got a funny way of dealing with it. If Indian diaspora talks to the Prime Minister or to any cabinet minister, possibly he might listen. But if I talk to them, they may not. So this myth that Indian diaspora is very, very, well connected and he's listened to is real. So people pay attention. So I think the power of the Indian diaspora in shaping Indian polity and policy has not been very strong. So it's time for that to happen. So it's not just the economic narratives, but something else too. It's also, the other thing is also that because of the Indian diaspora, India is celebrated now. Indian diaspora in the US, as I know, most of them are made well in lives. They pay their taxes. They work hard, they're diligent, they understand the rule of law, which means they create an impression of India back here. And so I think if India has grown, Indian diaspora is also to be credited with that. And in a sense, it was good because if they had stayed back in India, they would have been part of the restless generation who would have had less opportunities to deal with. And so there would have been a problem for India. So they wouldn't have been an asset. It's good that they got exported out, and maybe now many of them are coming back. So they shouldn't come back for retirement. They should come back when they can actually do something for India. That's what I would say.
Well, I remain forever in the debt of Sanjay Tiwari at the University of Chicago, who taught me calculus in 1979. And my inability to retain it, it was not his fault. Dan, talk a little bit. Yeah, you've had some experience with these diaspora-related questions, not just in relation to India, but also with regard to other countries. Did that sound like a familiar story?
No, it does. I mean, we should be honest. I think at least some Indians left India during the days of state socialism because the opportunities were not there, right? The opportunities today, I hope, are there and will continue to be there for the next 30, 40, 50, 100 years, given India's trajectory, which I think is secular, kind of looks like this. That's the good news. I would like to sort of spin off this question to talk about Indian soft power in the world, because I think there's a view that China has just surged so far ahead of India in terms of global influence, in terms of global footprint, in terms of its stature, as sort of what Xi Jinping would like to be a peer with the United States. You know, the Chinese view is not that all countries are created equal. It's that really China and America sit at the top of this hierarchy, and then there are other countries underneath. That is not an American view. But India's soft power is an extraordinary advantage. I'm not sure that China, under the current system, has a lot of soft power. China has money power. China has trade, investment, other flows. China has people power in the form of hundreds of thousands of university students in this country and other countries. So there are forms of global influence that China exerts. But a lot of it is material hard power, military, diplomatic. India just has a totally different form of influence in the West and in Africa and in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. It is that old civilizational and cultural influence. It's new here in the United States, relatively new. It's very old. If you go to Burma or Indonesia or Malaysia, you see it everywhere, right? This is an extraordinary asset for a rising global power. Not to have a diaspora of quote-unquote foreign agents, because Indians abroad are not that. India is not organizing people of Indian descent abroad the way the Chinese Communist Party is trying to organize people of Chinese descent abroad. You've seen that in Australian universities. You've seen it in US universities. India is not running a kind of a united front set of tactics with overseas Indians. But really, I think Indians in all of our societies can help us understand what is happening in India today and tell that story in a very compelling way. India, I'm afraid, is going to be underweight in hard power for quite some time, but I do think this is a compensating factor that's hugely important.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Miriam Simantwala from the State Department. I wanted to touch on that India soft power issue, which you raised, which I think is extremely powerful. You know, one thing that we see is China trotting out, you know, we're more Buddhist than Buddhist, and trying to sort of bring together the Buddhist cultures or Buddhist diasporas in different countries. India is also doing the same with Buddhism and Hinduism. And you know, my question is, India's strength, really, as I saw it working in New Delhi, is its syncretic composite culture, which was very open, very inclusive in a lot of ways, multilingual, multi-religious, and often, you know, even between North and South, multicultural. So how can India do a better job of projecting its soft power, and can you comment on India-China soft power competition with respect to religion and religion as a tool of foreign influence?
I have a very, I don't know if my answer would satisfy you, but more than 110, 120 years ago, a little earlier than that, Swami Vivekananda came to Chicago. And in the speech that he made, I think he summarized and captured how India would see religion. He said India's greatness is not because of our tolerance of every other country or every other religion, which applies to everything else, not just religion, but he said the very fact that we accept it as our own. And so India's philosophy of acceptance and not mere tolerance, I think, is an extraordinarily powerful idea, the way I see it. And by not actually wanting to state our soft power, by not carrying it as a flag or not carrying it as a brand value, I think that's a real exercise of soft power. And that's what India has been quietly doing. And to me, in the Indian context, religion is not state-sponsored in India. Though the Indian narrative today, political narrative, is being made into so much of religious discussions, but the state of India has never really promoted religion. India has never really looked at using religious mechanism. We don't have India chairs or India study centers in every university funded by the government of India, except in Chicago, where because of the Vivekananda centenary, it was part of the cultural process of exchange. So I think in India, Indian religious expansion never happened because of state sponsorship. It all stopped when the kings did. When I think the last Buddhist surge that India sent out was when King Ashoka ruled many, many, many years ago. After that, we never really had people going out and saying, take to Hinduism. Indian Hinduism is spreading on its own because of people wanting it and liking it. I think actually yoga contributes a lot more to understanding Indian Hinduism than anything else, because yoga is such a powerfully sold marketable commodity today. Now, the Americans have made it a $30 billion industry, so it obviously is and you know, it's a, so the real sale of Hinduism comes from, I wouldn't want to stand in judgment of these people, the so-called religious leaders, so-called godmen, etc., who come to the United States and who package it so nicely and sell it across it. So it's not the state, but I think it's individual entrepreneurial ventures of these people who actually take Hinduism across. But I don't know about China. I don't think I can comment on how they do it, except I know the Confucian study centers in various universities that I'm associated with, but I really don't know how the state does it. But I think India will do good if it doesn't really use religion as a tool of soft power. That's my personal view.
I just have 10 seconds on this, which is that, you know, the richness of Indian culture, including Indian religious culture, is syncretic. I mean, you see it everywhere you go in India. You see it in Muslim communities, you see it in Hindu communities, you see it in Jain communities, you see it in Christian communities. I think that's one of the great miracles of India, and we should be careful of anything that would threaten that, because we live in an era globally of polarization and extreme voices. And I hope India can protect itself from that phenomenon.
I may have something to throw in on this one as well. You know, I've been teaching a course at Georgetown in the master's program, the School on Foreign Service, for the past 8 years or so. And for the past 5 years, I think, or so, I've assigned the Bhagavad Gita to my class. And I use that as a way to open the door into discussions about duty. and in some cases due to extreme circumstances. For example, the people who are responsible for the custodianship of the American nuclear deterrent and the preparations that they have to undertake, not in the hope that we come to the J. Robert Oppenheimer moment in the quotation about destroyer of worlds, but in order to maintain peace. And it's an interesting way. I could get that out on the basis of the first 3 teachings of the Gita, but I always assign the whole thing. The reason I do it is because every time I do it, 1 or 2 students in the class have this sort of amazing experience with the book. It's something that they hadn't encountered before, and it's on one hand a very interesting religious work. On the other hand, it's also quite an interesting meditation on being, and it's a very rich experience. And I think that there's a lot of that that's readily available and maybe even a little underappreciated. On the yoga question, I'm just last night, my daughter and her current her boyfriend were having a discussion about how one of the problems with yoga in the United States is that it's turned simply into an exercise program and has been kind of detached from all the spiritual elements of it that can, in principle, accompany it. Anyway, so anything else we can help clarify or at least China. China and cultural influence, China and soft power, China and its outposts, Confucianism. Well, Dan, over to you on the Confucian
You're the
question.
theologian up here.
Well, all right.
I'm nowhere near the.
I'm not joking. You actually are. I mean,
Okay, all right. I think, the contribution of Confucianism to current Chinese policy is a subject for another day. So I think I'll pass on that one. But yes, please. Yeah, thanks. It'll just be a little easier on the people who might be tuning in.
My name is Shahira, and I study at the George Washington University. The vibe I get from the panel which preceded this one was that everything at the very domestic, the very grassroots level is very rosy and everything is fixed in India. My question is very specific about how the current government specifically and the current government spokespeople have weaponized the idea of sedition. Only yesterday, around 14 students of Aligarh Muslim University have been charged with sedition across the country. It's not because you talked about evidence. On the same note, when you mentioned that we've only had 1 lynching as a consequence of fake news, I think that was...
I said I gave that lynching as an example of how fake news is abused. I didn't say only 1 lynching because of fake
I could have been mistaken when I heard you mention 1. But there have been 30 only the last 1 year. There have been a lot of propaganda in how the idea of nationalism in India has been weaponized, particularly when we see that the very prime minister of the country follows a certain set of people on Twitter who glorify the murder of journalist Gauri Lankesh, for example. All of these really tie into the question of, if at all, governance and the government and the, I wouldn't question you on the BJP spokespeople because I understand you wouldn't be able to, testify for their position. But does it really translate into a democracy at the very grassroots, which is thriving, when we have thousands of students on the road, thousands of farmers committing suicide, people dying in demonetization, asking whether 15 lakh rupees, which were promised, are primarily. So all of these are questions which really pique our interest into, critiquing whether or not the picture which is being painted is at all the truest picture.
When you said the previous panel, you meant this panel or the panel before this? Okay. So if I mentioned a rosy picture, it's in comparison. So let me be very, very clear. Is it an ideal state? Absolutely no. Now, as a citizen activist, there's so many lacunas which I'd like to definitely get addressed. But the way I look at it is, if I were to look at 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, when I raised the issue of indigenous communities, I was beaten up and arrested. Did it become news? No. Absolutely, it wasn't news, right? I was thrown into jail. I was beaten up by the very same state. It's not in power now, but a different dispensation. But what is good news is when I approached the National Human Rights Commission, we had a democratic institution which actually set it right, ordered the government to withdraw all its cases against me, and put the government on its knees and got rightful justice to indigenous communities on whose behalf I had sued the government. Now I look at the opportunity that existed for me and for voiceless indigenous communities to actually stand up to the might of the state and stand against them. 15 years ago, I'm just giving historical evidences, a power plant was conceived at the pressure of a very rich industrialist to be put up in the Western Ghats, which we, along with the indigenous communities, opposed and got it stopped. Now that's an expression of citizen voice, which never gets really highlighted because neither society nor governments want to highlight these kind of stories. So when I look at the kind of expressions that happen today, it's because of multiple voices like this are happening all over the country, but today you have the tools to make them heard. You have technology, you have television, you have media attention, you have social media, the various ways in which I wish I had Twitter 30 years ago when I sued the state. Everybody everywhere around would have heard about it. So I think today the world has got more opportunities to hear, the world is more mature, the world is more primed. And that exactly is what is citizen engagement. There's that much more opportunities for them to engage. I talk to a lot of young people who get angry when something like this happens. If you look at the Me Too movement itself, the way a lot of very big people in India also were exposed, and they've actually lost their jobs, and whatever job, whether it's a minister's job or whether it's a career, corporate entity, etc. Now, allowing those voices to get expressed, that's why I said authorizing environment. The authorizing environment is shifting. No government, however mighty and powerful it may look today, can escape the power of the authorizing environment. So to me, everything that you narrated is a silver lining that I see. The silver lining is going to get expanded, it's going to keep growing, and that will crowd out any kind of authoritarian tendencies. To me, that's an expression of democracy. The very fact that these voices are getting heard, it can be heard by you speaking, as much as a person like Gauri Lankesh could speak what she wanted. India also tolerates a contemporary of Gauri Lankesh putting up the idol of Rama and peeing on it. Right? That guy also lives. He can also talk about it. He also does what he does. You don't have to express your dissent about religion and Hinduism by peeing on an idol somebody else worships. So you have to respectfully disagree. So as much as tolerance is about tolerating all the nonsense, it's also about expressing what you want to express in a decent way. So I think the very fact so many people expressing their opinions and ideas is good news to people like me. I think after some time out, people realize that you can't crowd out those voices, but we'll have to learn to separate the noise from the voice. And that's a big deal. And most of us love to hear the noises, but are we really separating the noise from the voice? The only question I would ask. So to me, the biggest challenge for Indian democracy is not participation, is not engagement. It is voice poverty. And in a sense, we're not understanding whose voice are we listening to, whose voice are we expressing. I'll stop there.
So could I just address your question, because I think it's very good. Two things. One, we were talking about Indian soft power and India's trajectory. Tolerance is obviously central to India's soft power. I also think its tolerance is central to the juxtaposition of the Indian system and the Chinese system, including for the foreign investment community and others. Rule of law, protection of free speech, protection of minority rights, these are all central strengths that India has enjoyed and would not want to whittle away. That's one. But two, this is maybe a separate conversation for another time, but why did he get elected? Modi and the BJP created a cross-cutting coalition that spoke to so many aspirational dimensions of Indian society. Young people, people in many different regions, people in many different walks of life. And it was that promise of economic modernization and opportunity that I think enabled the BJP to win the first governing majority, simple governing majority, not coalition, for the first time in decades. I don't know how this campaign is going to play out, but that message is very powerful, and that message is undercut by intolerance and other forms of what you were describing. So I hope and assume that in a democracy, that campaign messaging and that governing agenda speaks to all Indians,
Thanks. Well, we actually started a few minutes early, and I think we might end a few minutes early. I see that the next thing on the agenda is concluding remarks. I hope that's not referring to by me. But I think first of all, I want to thank Balu and Dan for a really illuminating discussion. And I thank you, all of you, for the questions that you contributed and the discussion points that you added to it. So I think we should all give ourselves a big round of applause. Second, I want to reintroduce my colleague Aparna Panda, and I guess those will be the concluding remarks.
I'm not going to take too much of time, especially since a number of people in this audience have actually been here since 9 a.m. I'd actually like to thank all of you for being here. It's difficult to spend 6.5 hours listening to people speak. So I'd like to thank you for your patience. I'd like to thank all our speakers, both from this panel and the first two panels who came, those of you who came from India all the way. I'd like to thank the panelists from DC and the Indian Embassy. And I will not come between you and the rest of your evening, especially since it's gorgeous outside and there's no rain. So thank you very much.
Good. Well done. Enjoy.